I will go ahead and share.
Yep, we're going. So it's all you, Dylan.
All right, everyone see my slides all right here?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about GIST and BFO, or the basic formal ontology, another upper level ontology. And one of the first questions you might ask is why compare these two? They're two upper ontologies with pretty different methodologies, and so you might think that they're incommensurable in some way, or there's no value in comparing them. Well, I was thinking about that a little bit, and I was thinking there are at least a few different potential benefits of comparing GIST and BFO, and here are a few things that came to mind. You could reach a better understanding of each of the ontologies. At least this is the case for me. I've been at Semantic Arts for just over a year now, and I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert in either GIST or BFO. But in looking closely at each of them, I think that's very helpful to come to a better understanding of them. And kind of along those lines, you can reach a better understanding of what each ontology is well suited for. What purposes might you use one of these upper level ontologies for? And then finally, I think we could get a better picture of how upper ontologies can live in harmony, whether that means they're used in conjunction with one another, or maybe there's a more pluralist picture where one is just used for particular purposes and the other is used for another purpose. Okay, so kind of to these ends, I'm going to talk about the following things. I'm going to start with kind of a high-level comparison of GIST and BFO, talk about some of the general methodological presuppositions, and then I'll talk about some of the numbers too, just the class and property counts that just kind of give a 30,000 feet up view of GIST and BFO. And then I'm going to talk about a couple different examples that I hope will illustrate some of the key differences, at least in my eyes, between GIST and BFO. And then if we have some time at the end, I'm going to talk about something that I've been working on recently, which is a bridge between GIST and BFO, which kind of gets to that last potential benefit of whether upper ontologies can live in harmony. This would be a case where they might be used in conjunction with one another. So see if we get to that if we have time. All right, so at the most general level, if you know a little bit about GIST and BFO, they're of course both upper or top level or foundational ontologies. You can pick whichever metaphor you most prefer. BFO was initially developed by Barry Smith and Pierre Grenon, both with philosophy backgrounds. Barry Smith, I believe, is at SUNY Buffalo's philosophy department currently. And GIST, of course, was developed by our own Dave McComb. At the very general level, BFO is higher up in some sense. It's a little bit more domain neutral, whereas GIST is, while it's quite general still, it's more focused on the enterprise. And so, in GIST, you're going to see concepts that are relevant to business use cases like account or contract, where you might not expect to see that in BFO. In fact, those aren't in BFO. I thought it'd be helpful to get a statement of the purpose, just a simple statement of the purpose of each of these upper level ontologies, starting with BFO. And this comes from a text, Building Ontologies with Basic Formal Ontology. BFO is an upper level ontology developed to support integration of data obtained through scientific research. And then the statement of GIST purpose comes from our website. GIST is Semantic Arts minimalist upper ontology for the enterprise. It's designed to provide the maximum coverage of typical business concepts with the fewest number of primitives and the least amount of ambiguity. So those be helpful to have that kind of side-by-side comparison of the purpose. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about methodological and design commonalities and differences. And this isn't meant at all to be like an exhaustive list or anything like that. It's just some of the major commonalities and differences in my eyes. First, both ontologies make use of high-level disjoints. So GIST does this, and we make a point to point this out on our website even, that high-level disjoints can be useful for inferencing purposes and for identifying potential inconsistencies. And so you'll see at the top level, they're explicit disjoints. Both GIST and BFO encourage a certain distinctionary pattern of formal definitions. That's one of our patterns that we use. That distinctionary term is one I borrowed from Dave. He's written about this, about, what's the most useful way to formulate a definition of a class. And BFO advocates for something similar, like a genus species sort of formal definition. They both advocate for a minimal set of concepts that can be extended to a wide range of domains. And this last point, I think, is an interesting one. In my eyes, they would both advocate for a balance of utility and realism, although the scales might tip in slightly different ways. They might think about this balance in slightly different ways. Okay, so some key differences. How the formal definitions are currently specified. I thought this would be good to mention that currently GIST is an LDL ontology, L description logic. It's in that profile, something we've been talking about internally recently. Whereas BFO, most of its formal definitions, its axioms, are currently specified in first order logic, so they're not in OWL. I'll mention this and come back to it in a little bit. There is an experimental version of BFO that's out there, BFO 2.1, which contains a core bit of what's called the relations ontology. There's a number of relations. I think it's like 80 or so relations that are used for property restrictions and defining classes. And again, that's in this version 2.1. But in the 2.0 version, there aren't relations. They're just the classes. Another difference that's worth pointing out, well, there's this agreement about utility to guide design, but utility for what? What are the use cases? So there's going to be a difference there. Another big point of difference to point out is the use of technical versus everyday terminology. In BFO, you see much more technical jargon, whereas in GIST, you are likely to see more everyday common sense terminology. Now, these things come with pros and cons. Sometimes it's useful to use technical vocabulary, particularly when there are ordinary English words that are kind of overloaded or they're ambiguous or something like that. Sometimes it's useful to just use a technical term and say, hey, I'm going to use this to mean this very precise thing. So you can understand that there's some motivation for using technical vocabulary. On the other hand, there's a great advantage to using everyday terminology, and using common sense terms makes it easier to just pick up the ontology and put it to use quite quickly. So some interesting discussion to be had on that point. And then finally, this is a point that I'm going to come back to in a little bit. There is, this kind of difference in approach to building ontologies where, there might be this focus on carving nature at its joints, or, picking out natural kinds or universals, versus finding just the most useful classes or categories. Again, I'll come back to that point in a little bit. Okay, I the next thing I want to do is give this high-level overview. I'm gonna run through these numbers real quick, and then if there are any questions or comments, I'll open things up. But first, I'll point out these numbers. So on the left-hand side, we have just 11.0. That's our latest major release. In that release, we had roughly 140 classes, around 100 object properties, and 40 data type properties, whereas BFO 2.0 it was much more compact at 35 total classes, and as I mentioned before, didn't have properties included within it. But as I also mentioned, BFO 2.1, this experimental version, which brings in a core portion of the relations ontology to further define axioms, you get roughly 80 object properties there. Okay, let's see. Yeah, why don't I go ahead and stop there? And I can't see if there are any questions at the moment.
But keep an eye and call them out. There's nothing up right now, though.
Okay. All right. So I'll push forward here. Next thing I wanted to do was just give a very brief picture of what BFO looks like. Now, what I don't intend to do with this is run through the entire hierarchy and define all the terms in here. I really just wanted to include these as a point of reference if we want to return to them. But I did want to give everyone an idea of just the general shape of BFO if you're not familiar. At the very top level of BFO, there's a class entity. Everything's an entity. And then beneath that, there's a division into what are called continuance and what are called occurrence. Going back and forth between these two slides. This is the continuant side of things, and this is the occurrent side of things. On the continuant side of things, the paradigm example of a continuant, I think, is like a material object, like a pen. It's something that, in some sense, continues through time. It exists right now, and it exists a couple seconds from now. It's continuing through time in that sort of sense. And so that's a paradigm case of a continuant. On the occurrence side of things, you want to think of events. And in fact, they've got a process class, which is really close to what we have as just event. You could think of a process as an event. And there are some reasons why I think process here is perhaps an unfortunate name. We can talk about that in a little bit, but really there is this kind of division between individuals or objects and events. That's kind of one way of thinking about the general divide there. Okay. Any questions there? Or shall I push forward?
No hands currently.
All right. Okay, so I promised that I was going to come back to this point about natural kinds and universals. And I wanted to talk about this briefly before I dive into some specific examples. There's this quote from Socrates, which I like. It's in one of Plato's dialogues called the Phaedrus, where he says, "I myself am a lover of these processes of division and bringing together as aids to speech and thought. And if I think any other man is able to see things that can be naturally collected into one and divided into many, him I follow after and walk in his footsteps as if he were a god." I don't know, maybe Socrates was a fan of ontologists. But this quote, I think, kind of captures the spirit behind the more contemporary ideas of natural kinds and universals, and even those concepts they go back quite a ways. And I wanted to focus on a particular phrase from that passage. He says naturally collected, and there's a good question of what somebody might mean by naturally collected. Is it something that, it comes easy for human beings psychologically to collect things together in a certain way? Or is it that, you know, what it means for something to be naturally collected is to collect it in such a way that it respects the objective boundaries of reality or something like that? I think it's an open question, but maybe just as a starting point, we could all agree that the following two classes are quite different from one another. So take on the one hand the class of all tigers, and then take the class of all tigers plus Tiger Woods. It's kind of a weird class, right? It is a class, it is a set of things, but I think we would all agree that the first class, the class of all tigers, is perhaps a more natural grouping than the class of all tigers plus Tiger Woods. Is probably not even worth giving that latter class a name. It's very unlikely that it would ever be useful in any context. Okay, so I've got that as kind of a starting point. Now, on the other hand, sometimes it may just be useful for a concept not to carve perfectly at nature's joints. In fact, you might focus on something a little bit different, what William James called the cash value of a belief or a term or a concept. It asks a question like, what is the cash value of defining a term or concept in a certain way? Or in other words, what are the practical consequences that follow from a certain definition? I included a picture of William James on the side here, just to show that philosophers can be stylish from time to time. This is actually a picture from 1865. I think it's kind of crazy. It almost looks like a time traveler. Okay. Any questions there before I dive into an example? We still good?
No hands up. You're just explaining things perfectly, Dylan.
All right, great. Okay, so here's an initial example that I wanted to look at, and it's focused around the class gist place. And just as a refresher for those who haven't taken a close look at gist in a bit, here are the subclasses of gist place. We have geopoint, georegion, governed georegion, time zone, georoute, geosegment, geovolume, landmark, and building. Okay, and so now we've got BFO's continuant hierarchy on the left and gist place on the right. And I think a really cool thing to see here is that there are some classes in BFO that correspond really closely, or maybe they're just equivalent to classes in gist. And so if you look here, hopefully you can see my cursor. I think you will be able to. You can see the spatial region class in BFO, and you can see all of these different subclasses. There is a zero-dimensional spatial region, which is just what we would call a geopoint. There is a one-dimensional spatial region, which is what we would call a geosegment. There is a two-dimensional georegion, or a spatial region, which we would just call a georegion. And then there's a three-dimensional spatial region, which we would just call a geovolume. So interesting to see that correspondence. Now, there's this other relation, which I've highlighted in green here, which shows that, okay, there's something else in here. There's landmark and building, and those would probably fall under object, a material entity, on that side of things. And so the reason I wanted to point this out is that arguably, someone might argue that, okay, here's the natural grouping of things. It makes sense to have all of these dimensional or dimensioned classes falling under spatial region, but maybe landmark or building is an outlier. On the other hand, you might think that it's just useful to have all of these things collected under gist place. It's just useful from a modeling standpoint. This is where you would expect to find building. is under a place. It's just a very natural, common sense way of thinking about things. And so this goes back to that point about carving at nature's joints versus finding what are the most useful groupings of things. And this, I would argue, is a place where, okay, yeah, maybe you could argue that it's not the most natural collection, but it's a very useful one. Okay. I'll move on to another example. And this is something we've been talking quite a bit about internally, very recently, in fact, and it surrounds the concepts of events, tasks, and processes. So in particular, we've been having some internal discussion around the definitions of just event and just task, among others. I know there's a lot of text here, but I promise I'll unpack everything here. So Dave has recently pointed out that there's a useful modeling pattern where something can go through a three-stage process. A task can go from being defined to being scheduled to being completed. And it's also useful to think of task as a subclass of just event. In fact, currently is a subclass of just event. And currently, all instances of just event must have start and end dates. Now, given that a defined task may never get worked on, it might not even be scheduled to be worked on, not all instances of just task will have planned or actual start or end dates. So there's a kind of tension there that we've been hoping to resolve. I'll come back to that in a sec. As I mentioned earlier, BFO has a class that's very similar to just event. It's called process. And according to BFO 2.1, at least, all processes exist at some temporal region. They have what are called process boundaries, which are essentially start and end dates. And now a merely defined task, one that gets defined, but it's never actually scheduled, it's not undertaken, it wouldn't count as a process in BFO's sense, but it would count as a just event, right? And if you were to remove the date restrictions on just event would end up becoming a more general class than BFO's process class, which I think is kind of interesting. And again, one might argue that BFO's process class carves nature more closely at the joints. On the other hand, I think sometimes useful modeling patterns, such as the three-stage process for tasks, can be a good guide to ontology development. So we see kind of the same sort of balance there. You can see the argument in favor of grouping things in one way, but then you see that there's this more useful way of grouping things here. So
Dylan, Rebecca's got her hand up. Do you want to take a minute or?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a good stopping point.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on this a little bit. One of the reasons we're interested in allowing a task not to have any dates, just to be either defined or defined, is that otherwise you have to have this kind of shadow. So for every scheduled or ongoing or completed task, you have to have or may have a defined task. And, this becomes a very cumbersome mechanism. So, we decided that, or we are in the process of deciding that a task can go through, as Dylan says, multiple phases, where at some point it may have no dates, and then maybe a start date, and then maybe an end date. So it's just this idea of eliminating, two different objects that shadow one another.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. So it's like simplicity, I think, is another thing that comes into the picture. That's another useful consideration.
Mike Sullivan's got his hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question. what were the enterprise influences for coming up with this process, which I really like, by the way? I mean, it seems to be very useful in terms of things like supply chain and those kinds of things. So I was curious as to, from your client perspective, which projects kind of influenced this thinking.
Yeah, so I mean, I can think of a couple use cases that come to mind, and if any of the other semantic arts folks want to chime in with some use cases that they've encountered, that'd be great too. But I know that you know, one that we're currently looking at is publication workflows. So document work on documents, you know, they'll undergo changes over time, and it's helpful to use this kind of model in that kind of case. So workflows in particular, I know is a good use case there. Any others by chance that come to mind for other semantic arts folks? All right, well, hopefully, Michael, that satisfies your answer a little bit, or your question a little bit.
There was one in the chat as well, Dylan, from
Mhm.
Greg. Might have been a
Great.
little bit ago. I missed it initially. Perhaps
Yep.
we could think of a building as a continuant fiat boundary or site.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's great. So I didn't mean to say that was the only way of thinking about a building. And in fact, I think that is kind of, you know, thinking of it as a continuant fiat boundary or a site is a plausible ontological commitment to make. But that raises a really interesting question. It's something I've been thinking about in relation to, you know, the relationship between BFO and GIST recently, is that, you know, it often seems like in using BFO, you're almost forced to make certain ontological commitments that are not likely to be agreed upon from ontologist to ontologist. So, you know, perhaps one ontologist might be inclined to, you know, class a building under object or material object, whereas another might think, no, it's really just a site. It's something that's ontologically different. You know, that can create challenges for interoperability when, you know, you've got one ontologist who's thinking, okay, yeah, let's put this thing under this philosophical term, and maybe it's plausible, but to someone else it's not. But certainly, I think that's right, and that's a plausible way of thinking about buildings, at least. But it does kind of raise this other interesting question, I think, whereas where, you know, there's a question of whether using an ontology that's way up there and has these sort of technical philosophical terms, whether that sort of forces your hand ontologically in a way that's not really necessary in a lot of cases. So that's my thought on that. Any other questions or follow-ups to that?
Michael's got his hand up.
Yes,
Michael.
hi. So,
Yep.
and that, someone asked about other examples, and I thought of one. We're working with a major global company, and they're tracking their applications for privacy-related information. So they have a bunch of tasks. They have to look at an application and do a assessment to say, is this application, you know, checking all the boxes in terms of what we need to do for privacy-related things. And there's just tasks, you know, people get tasks. Okay, you must do this first. And after you've done that, you must do the next thing. And so the overall process has stages and statuses. So but as it happens, this task was under evolution. So it was kind of like a moving target. So we just did something in term, but hope we may go back and model that with the newer version of GIST once it settles down.
Any other questions, comments so far?
That's all that's up currently.
All we got for now. Okay, great. Well, that means I'll have a little bit of time to talk about bridging GIST and BFO, which again is something I've been working on recently. And you might wonder, what are the motivations for building a subclassing bridge between GIST and BFO? Had a couple ideas for motivations. These aren't the only reasons you might be interested in it, but these are a couple. The first reason is, you might be interested in building this kind of bridge for the same reason you might be interested in having an upper ontology at all. It would improve interoperability. You might be able to align existent client ontologies with evolving enterprise ontologies. Would promote collaboration. Another motivation you might have is that you might be able to illuminate possible distinctions to make. There might be in building connections between ontologies, it's possible that that could give you ideas about how to change one or the other ontology. So those are just a couple of motivations that came to mind. Now, there are a few different things in trying to build a subclassing bridge. There were a few different things that I thought would be good to keep in mind, or there'd be sort of things to keep in mind as I was designing. First, you want to be as specific as possible with the BFO superclasses. Now, I should say a little bit more about this. It's something that I mentioned earlier on, is that because BFO is quite general, it's kind of way up there, you might expect for BFO to sort of sit on top of the GIST classes in a way. And in fact, as I got into this, that's what I found by and large. There are some counterexamples to that, but generally speaking, BFO can, those will mostly be superclasses for GIST classes. Also, you want to stay true to the meanings of the GIST and BFO classes as much as possible, of course. And then I also want to make sure to try to preserve logical consistency, and really more specifically to ensure that there were no subclasses of OWL nothing when the bridge was built. Okay, and so for now, I just wanted to provide just one slice of this subclassing bridge as kind of a starting point. And if others are interested in talking about other parts of the bridge, I'd be happy to talk about it. But I just wanted to give a sense of how this ends up looking. And it's kind of as you might expect. We've got the BFO classes, the super classes in blue up here at the top, material entity, and then object, and then physical identifiable item, the GIST class falls right underneath that, and all of its subclasses fall nicely underneath that. And chose this example because it was one of the more simple examples that worked out quite nicely, but by and large, this is the kind of thing you would see with the subclassing bridge. And so again, this is kind of it goes back to that question of how the two ontologies could work in harmony. This is a case where they might be fruitfully used in conjunction if you had a bridge like this. Okay, so I'm already
Dylan, sorry, real quick. Ellen posted something in the comments in the chat. This may have been mentioned already. What organization is leading the efforts for BFO to move forward to better understand future goals?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I know Barry Smith and Pierre Grenon were some of the initial developers, and I know that, that Barry Smith is at SUNY Buffalo, and they kind of lead a lot of the development. But yeah.
Cool. And then we got two hands here, Michael and then Scott.
Yeah, just one thing I noticed here, you kind of hinted at it earlier. Don't go back there, but you had the slide connecting up the regions, the 0-dimensional geopoint, the 2-dimensional geo segment, blah, blah, blah. So what's interesting here is, I think it's correct what you've done here. Physical identifier item would be properly placed under object as a subclass. However, the just landmark, which happens to be under just place, here, if you're going to make a proper bridge and connect things up as much as you could, you would have a relationship that connects landmark to a 2 or 3-dimensional region. So you'd have a new property that has physical region or something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Which could be part of a bigger, more robust bridge.
Right.
And then Scott.
Yeah, in one of your earlier examples about sort of nature carving versus, well, I guess the tiger one wasn't a very pragmatic case. But you know, that tiger would be a super class, like the tigers plus Tiger Woods would be a super class of tigers. And so that made me think that you might just as often find the more pragmatic classes be the super classes as you would the subclasses, maybe even more often, in that they're going to include things that don't fit into joint carving classes. And I was just curious, like, if there's a easy, like, 1-minute example of that, I'd be curious about it. But if there's not one that, if it derail the conversation, don't worry about it.
Yeah, no. You know, if I'm getting the question right, you know, I think you're right about the Tiger Woods example. That class is the super class of you know, the tigers class, just the tigers, and it is the more general class in that case that is the arguably more unnatural one. And I think you know, arguably the just place example could be like that, where it's like you might think a superclass of BFO's spatial region class, but it turns out to be a pragmatic class. It's a useful class to have. Something else that you mentioned there, which I think is really interesting, is like, you know, does it turn out that the subclass is sometimes a more useful one? There's like, which one of those is more often more useful? And I don't know if anything can be said in general there, but it seems like, you know, sometimes a restriction of a more natural class could be useful in some cases, and in some cases expanding on the more natural class could be useful.
Got 3 more here. Rebecca's first.
Yeah, I'm wondering about this subclassing of landmark. I think there are cases where a landmark is just a georegion. For example, you know, the place where George Floyd was killed. For some reason, that springs to mind. That's not an object, that's a georegion. So I'm not sure if this works in that specific case.
Yeah. Well, that is a good question. I think currently in GIST we have landmark subclassed under physical identifiable items. So maybe that's a consideration also to reconsider that subclassing.
Okay.
Yeah, landmark in just to jump in here, really does correspond to the physical thing, the building or the fire hydrant or whatever.
Well, I have to make a new issue then.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I think that's a good example. Yeah.
Great. Greg has his hand up.
Yeah. So maybe two comments on the two discussions going on here. So about the landmarks and buildings. I was related a story once that someone went to a meeting at Psych with a room full of ontologists, and they argued apparently for hours about what was in the room, because some people believed that only like the physical furniture or the things on the wall or the construction materials that compose that room were the room, and others were clearly thinking of a physical space or something sort of abstract and geometrical going on. And so they would have been served well by making that distinction early on between we're talking about geometric things or we're talking about material things. And the other, so the second point to the conversation about tiger woods and tigers, which I think is great, but if you stop and say, well, which hat do I have on? Well, how am I looking at this? Are they both mammals? Are they both sort of examples of mammals, and so we can naturally put them in the same class? Or are they simply things called tiger? And what we're really looking at is just a use of language. And so it would be, these would be entries in the dictionary under tiger, right? You would have tiger woods, and then you would have all the other tigers, the mammalian species. So those are just two clear lines of distinction that need to be made in any ontology. Is, are we just talking language, or are we talking about the things? And then secondly, are we talking about some sort of abstract geometrical conceptualization of something, or are we talking about the physical appearance? And I think BFO makes an effort to sort of consciously go after that with the sort of endurant and continuant. But I think it gets problematic just because they've embedded time so deeply into the ontology that when you start talking about events or processes, and it just gets very muddled because you don't really have a handle on time, but you made it so central to your ontology. So anyway, those are just mainly comments, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, those some really good points, particularly about the Tiger Woods example. It certainly seems right to me that there are ways of thinking about that class and as being a little bit less weird than it might seem on its face. It's like the commonality might be they're all mammals. They're intrinsic features that they happen to share. So it's not as strange of a class in that respect. And then on the other hand, it might be more focused. The concept might be more focused on the extrinsic properties of them, that they all happen to share the same name. It's more about language, as you said. So I think that is a really good distinction to make.
Which I'd be curious, actually, language doesn't really show up in many ontologies. I mean, in fact, if you took BFO and said, well, how does BFO categorize GIST, for instance, as a domain-specific ontology having to do with enterprise, right? It may be all of GIST should just be treated as someone's model of the world, right? And so it's entirely categorized as a model, not as anything to do with the actual things that are in that model, but just a take on the world, basically, and just would sort of abstractly, or sorry, BFO might abstractly, as a top level, consider just someone's conceptualization of the world.
Yeah.
I've got two Michaels. Mike Ushold first.
I just want to highlight something that has come up a couple of times, and Dylan mentioned it, but I just want to emphasize its importance. And it's the relationship it's the idea of creating a class that has two different subclasses, which are arguably different ontological beasts. So, for example, in the case of tiger, a class that included tigers and tiger woods, they're obviously very different. You can say Tiger Woods is a person, but that's not what links tiger. It's the words, the name, which kind of has nothing to do with anything. But the more useful example, which Dylan mentioned, but only just brushed over very quickly, is the exact same thing is going on with just place. So you have two arguably very different beasts. One is really just a mathematical abstraction imposed upon the real world, which is a physical point or line or volume. You can talk about those things as purely mathematical things separate from the world, or you can impose them on the world, which is what we do all the time. But a landmark is really not at all a spatial construct. It relates to a spatial construct. So I think the broader point that I think is excellent, that Dylan has highlighted here is this notion of having classes that are abstractions, which include two or more different things that are maybe ontologically different. It's not carving nature at its joints in the purest way that BFO attempts to do, but it is carving up a way of looking at the world that can be useful. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I think it's excellent that Dylan has raised that point, and I just wanted to emphasize its importance.
Good. And Michael Sullivan.
Yeah, back to the Tiger Woods thing. It seems to me that that's a classic case of a category, not a class. I mean, it's categories are things that change all the time, and classes are things that shouldn't change. And think about flying tigers, and I mean, the example given is a bad one in the sense of one should never consider it as a class anyway, and you stated that early on.
Yeah.
And it's easily solved by, oh, well, we'll just create a category.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I see your point in that, because there's not a lot interesting that can be said of that second class. If you do make it a class, you could say a lot more interesting things about the initial one, or the more natural one. But yeah.
No other hands up currently.
The category versus class discussion, I guess, gets back to whether you actually would try to define that intersection. So are you looking for a commonality to define that class, or are you saying these things are just arbitrarily put together and therefore they're not a class, they're just a category? I think there's still a decision to be made there. If you're talking about language and you're categorizing words, then yes, they would be an intersection of things called tiger. Use the word tiger, right? So it all depends on the context, I guess, of what you're trying to do with the ontology, and not actually handling language in the ontology causes ambiguity with issues like this, because there's no way to consider it a class unless you're looking at it as language.
And Rebecca's got her hand up.
Yes, in response to the proposal about having that be a category instead of a class, I don't really see how that addresses the problem. Categories still have to have something in common. We don't just call call something a category that would arbitrarily label a set of things that don't have anything in common. So it seems to me you're faced with the same problem there.
Right, but maybe collection. I guess what is the term for that arbitrary or the set essentially of things?
Collection. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay.
And I believe, Rebecca, you've given that discussion about collections versus categories, was it? And classes.
I gave a presentation about classes versus categories. I don't think I brought collection in. That's a good idea, though.
Any other questions or comments?
Nothing up currently.
All right. Well, I just have one last slide. Has some takeaways. Mostly we've talked about these already, but just to reiterate, one of the points that I think we can take away is that different ontologies can be well suited for different purposes, and this could be a motivation for pluralism. It depends on what problem you're trying to solve. Maybe one ontology is better than another. Another point which we've been talking about is that carving at nature's joints is not always a perfect guide to ontology development. It can depend on the use case. And then this final point, which we talked a little bit about briefly, is that forced ontological commitment can sometimes be a threat to interoperability. We talked about the case of building earlier, where there's plausibly some disagreement about whether to think of it as a site or something along those lines, or rather as an object, a physical object. Another example that comes to mind is an organization, a material object aggregate. In fact, I think in the Common Core ontology, this is how it's classed. Or is it instead some kind of immaterial entity? So you start to, when trying to subclass things under these really high up abstract classes, you end up kind of being forced to make some of these kinds of decisions. And I think that's a point worth reflecting on too. But that is all I have. So
Becca's got her hand up.
Yeah, first, I'll say this was a very thoughtful and enlightening presentation, so thank you for that.
thank you.
I did have a couple of questions about something you said early on, which is that BFO just uses the distinctionary pattern, and my understanding is that BFO doesn't use those sorts of axioms, so equivalent to an intersection of
Right.
That's the distinctionary pattern, and I'm wondering where in BFO you see that sort of thing.
Okay, yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, one thing to say right away is that you know, and I would have to look closer at BFO 2.1 to see if something like that pattern pops up. But where I think I was where I had initially gotten that commonality from was in this building ontologies with basic formal ontology, where they do advocate a sort of genus species kind of definition pattern, which I think is kind of similar to our distinctionary pattern with the equivalent class, where you say, okay, here's the superclass, and then here's what makes it different from other things that are in this superclass. Now, would they have the exact same pattern in 2.1 though? I'm not positive about that. So it could be that I'm overselling that commonality. Certainly possible. Yeah.
I mean, possibly the genus species thing is more parallel to subclassing. But the other thing I wanted to ask about is, you said BFO is not formalized using OWL. It's formalized using first order logic. Now I have an OWL file of BFO. Is that just some sort of translation of the native BFO?
Oh, right. Yeah. So I guess I should be more precise with what I said there. So yeah, there is an OWL version of just 2.0, and there is that OWL version of
BFO
2.0, and the OWL version of BFO 2.1. What 2.0 has is it has just the classes, and so certainly there are axioms in it. There are subclassing axioms in there, and so that I should have been more clear about. What it doesn't have, though, are any of the property restrictions, because it doesn't have any of the properties in there, and so it doesn't have those kinds of axioms in there. Yep. Any other questions or comments?
That looks to be everything on there.
All right, great. Well, it looks like we're just about at time anyways, so it's a good place to wrap things up. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dylan.
Thank
I'll
you.
send an email out later with the recording, but all these recordings are available on our YouTube and on the GIST page on the Semantic Arts website. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dylan.
Bye.
Yep,
Yeah.
thanks, Dylan. Thanks, everybody.